G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined this week's edition of the Pub Test, where we are continuing our Jack the Ripper suspect series, and in this one, we are looking at Thomas Cutbush. So who was he, and how does he fit into the Jack the Ripper saga? Well, Thomas was born not far from the Whitechapel area, about 3 miles or 5 kilometres, in 1866. Now, his father, and there's some debate about what happened here. Some say his father died when he was about 2 years old. Others suggest that he went off to New Zealand and maybe even over to Australia and got married a couple more times. But regardless, his father was no longer around, whatever happened there. But what happened then was his mother, who had some mental health issues, it's safe to say, was a bit eccentric. It was the word I think that people used for her at the time, and also deeply religious. Well, she raised Thomas herself along with her sister. So Thomas grew up with his mother and his aunt in a very, very strict religious household. Some people say that affected him and his view of women later in life. I would suggest perhaps that his behaviour was a lot to do with a fair few mental health issues himself, particularly if it's true that he was the nephew of the Chief of Scotland Yard, Cutbush, who suffered from mental health issues as well, which we will cover as we go through this. But it's in July 1888, so he's 22 years old. He gets in a job as a clerk at a tea trading company, but they let him go due to some aggressive behaviour. But he gets another job not long after, and it didn't turn out very well. See, his boss was a bit older, and he gave him a shove and pushed him down some stairs. Now, don't hate the bloke just because he got to live the dream. I'm sure at some point we've all wanted to do that. You've worked for somebody and it just drives you up the wall and just want to give him a shove. Well, actually, no. To be honest, that was a terrible thing that he did, because the poor bloke did end up unconscious for a couple of weeks. So, yeah, no, that is not the right behaviour. I was just trying to have a little bit of fun there. If you are in that situation at work and you can't stand it, then you need to sing my favourite song, and I don't know who has the copyrights on this, but let's go. He should have said, "You can take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more." Not, "I'll get my boss and shove him till he falls down to the floor." So yeah, we could see that his situation in life wasn't all that good in 1888, his mental state. But could you imagine then him trying to get another job? Because there's no real report that he found any meaningful employment after this event. Could you imagine he's turned up to your business and said, "Hey, I want a job." So you ring the previous employer and say, hey mate, I got Bushy here. Yeah, because Australia will just cut Bush, we'll call him Bushy. "Yeah, we got Bushy. He says he wants a job. Should I employ him? What's he like?" "Yeah, well, mate, don't upset him. He might shove you down some stairs." "Oh, that's great. I don't have stairs. That should work out perfectly." Yes, so as we see, even though that might seem funny, I think the serious part to it is I don't think he had any real prospects of getting work after that event. And probably quite rightly, because this aggressive behaviour didn't slow down at all. But now he was seeing a doctor, and I don't know what mental health help was around back then, but I am suggesting it wasn't great. But he was suspecting his doctor of poisoning him. So he was starting to get paranoid as well. And what is of note is that if the Superintendent of Scotland Yard, Cutbush, was Thomas Cutbush's uncle, well, he suffered from the same delusions, and he unfortunately took his own life in 1896 due to his mental health. So if there is that family connection, well, we can see that there was some serious mental health issues on both sides, on the Cutbush side and on his mother's side. And so that is just a serious statement to make. You can't excuse some of the behaviour that happens after this, but It was pretty tough if you were struggling mentally back then. You see, around 1891, there was some attacks happening to women. So what was happening was a bloke was running up and stabbing these women in the back or on the backside, and women around ages of 14 to 18, and then they'd take off. Now, it's suggested that possibly it was Thomas Cutbush performing those attacks, yet there's also evidence to suggest that someone else was doing those attacks as well, because no one could really identify him as the perpetrator of that. However, in 1891, it was reported to the police that Thomas Cutbush had held a knife to the throat of either his mother or his aunt. So they say, well, we better investigate this a bit further, and so they take him in. They do an evaluation and decide, well, he needs to go to Broadmoor. Now, Broadmoor seemed to be the place to go for all these suspected Jack the Ripper people. So many ones on this list have been there, and were probably there at the time when Thomas Cutbush is gone. I wonder if they actually had a club inside Broadmoor for Jack the Ripper suspects. It would not surprise me if they did, because the amount of ones that were going there. Yet, Thomas gets there, and Bushy says, well, you know what? They're a bunch of nutters. I'm not staying. So they weren't exactly guarding him all that well, and he goes over the top of a 12 to 14 foot fence, so you're talking like 3-4 meters, and he scaled it, and he's taken off. Now, it is suggested that he was going back home a bit, so obviously this attack with the knife didn't bother the mother or the aunt that much that they just reported him back to the police. In fact, it seems that they sort of covered for him. But during this time, we don't know a great deal officially of his movements, but he is spending time back at home with his mother and his aunt. A strange conversation is reported to have had where he's met someone who we don't really know who it was, but Thomas is claiming that people are chasing him because they think he's Jack the Ripper. And that's odd, considering the time, and we'll cover that. But whether that conversation actually happened, I don't know, but he's apparently reported that back to the mother and the aunt, and telling him where his whereabouts were, but he was going back home all the time. So I don't think they were exactly looking for him, but that's just an interesting little side note to this little story, whether that conversation actually happened, particularly considering the year. But at one point, he's at home and he's fallen asleep, and the aunt sees a knife on him and takes it away and actually hands it to the police, which does prove significant. Because they look at the knife and go, that's the type of knife used in these attacks on the women. So they come and arrest him. He's tried and convicted, even though at the trial no one could officially identify that this is the bloke doing these stabbing attacks. They put him into Broadmoor, and his mental health apparently at one point had a little spike where it improved, but generally from there on it just went downward really, really fast. He didn't look after himself, barely cleaned himself, and was just aggressive and angry to everybody there until eventually he passed away in 1903. So how does he fit in to the Jack the Ripper saga? Well, let's of note that it was in 1894 that the Sun newspaper named Thomas Cutbush as possibly Jack the Ripper, and they ran some stories showing why they believed that was the case. So this is years after he's already locked up in Broadmoor. But the police then do a thorough investigation on these allegations, and they say, look, it just wasn't him. In fact, Sir Melville Macnaghten piled on to this. This was the accusation that led to him writing the Macnaghten Memoranda. Yet Sir Melville, in his memoranda, said, I'll give you 3 other more likely suspects. My number 1, which I'm sure is Jack the Ripper, Montague Druitt. But it could have been Michael Ostrog, and maybe this Polish person Kamiński. Though he could have been referring to a different Polish person with very similar names, and they've all been covered already in this series. But McNaughton had already stated previous that, no, the Ripper's no longer around. He has passed away. So my question is, why did the police follow up this newspaper report and go and investigate Cutbush? Because, according to official records, the Ripper's no longer around. Some people point to Thomas Cutbush and say, look at what he was doing. He was in the area in 1888. He was very aggressive and had erratic behaviour, was showing violence towards his employer. And then he goes on this stabbing spree. And there's no doubt that he did some of those attacks. Now, what is of note of the crimes he was convicted on, this stabbing of women? And that is horrendous, but it certainly was nowhere near as terrible as the Jack the Ripper crimes. One, they were done in broad daylight and they didn't cause any lasting damage that we know of. And yet, it's interesting, it wasn't the first time these particular crimes had occurred. There was a person known as the London Monster, close to 100 years previous, that was running around doing the exact same things, running up to women and trying to just stab them and then run away. Now, the London Monster would have been 120 years old at the time of the Jack the Ripper crime, so maybe we need to run a video on him. Just let us know if you think we should do so. But Thomas Cutbush was copycatting the London Monster's crimes. But as the papers say, in 1888, in that 2-month span, these 5 crimes happened and then stopped. What was Thomas Cutbush doing during that time? So it's safe to say that Thomas Cutbush did not have the best start in life, nor the best help throughout his life. Struggled massively with mental health issues. But was he Jack the Ripper? Well, what do you think? Let us know down in comments. And just remember, the next video will be where I state my theory on the Jack the Ripper saga. You are going to hear my thoughts, get to see all my evidence that I think, and then you get to decide, does it pass the pub test? Is it plausible? Is it reasonable? Would the average person think that you're a total nutter yourself? Or actually, he's got something there. Well, look out for that. And in that, I will show the clues that I've been dropping along the way, leading up to my thoughts on this. The series will continue, though, because there's more suspects still to go after I state my case. And as I've always said in this as well, there's nothing wrong with a strong opinion. You need a strong opinion, and I have a strong opinion, but it doesn't necessarily mean my opinion is right. And I have learnt along the way in this series so far in comments where people have added more detail and extra evidence, and that is greatly appreciated, and that's what the pub test is about. We put it out there, we have the conversation. But thank you very much for watching. It honestly, genuinely is appreciated. And if you haven't, do this channel a favour and just smash that subscribe button. Find it somewhere there and just give it a good old hit. I'm Owen, you've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one.